David enters his family's meat shop, and his brother Alexei quickly scolds him for taking the truck home. Alexei also asks if David picked up the jerseys for the night, and David says he did. Later, David finds Alexei on the phone with his pregnant wife. Alexei, clearly stressed, jokes that David shouldn't have kids. After the call, David asks Alexei to help him grow plants to pay off his $80,000 debt. Alexei sarcastically responds that growing pot is exactly what he needs with a wife about to give birth. Curious, Alexei asks how much David owes, and he's shocked to learn it's $80,000, which David borrowed to invest in new technology. Alexei thinks it's a scam, but David insists it isn't. Their father interrupts and asks David about the jerseys, and although David says he has them, both his brother and father doubt him. Throughout the day, David visits several banks to apply for loans, but none are approved. He ends up late picking up the jerseys but manages to convince the owner to let him in. However, he gets a parking ticket and later gets another ticket while buying gardening books. Despite these setbacks, he tells Alexei the jerseys are in the truck, but later, the truck gets towed. In the end, David is the only one in the team photo wearing a jersey. Later, David visits his girlfriend, Emma. She asks if he's hiding something in his apartment since she can no longer visit, but David denies it. Then Emma reveals she's pregnant. David is shocked and tries to support her, but Emma decides to raise the baby on her own because she doesn't trust him. David then confides in his friend and lawyer Brett about Emma's pregnancy. At first, he was scared and confused, but as time passed, he began to think it might be a positive change. However, Brett suggests that Emma should consider ending the pregnancy, given David's own stresses. David argues that he might want a child, but Brett insists that David enjoys his freedom and wouldn't want kids, as they drain your energy. While they're talking, Brett's own kids interrupt, and he tells David he lacks the skills to raise a child. Despite this, David feels he needs more structure in his life. When David gets home, he finds an attorney named Mark Williams waiting for him. Thinking the lawyer is there about his debt, David tries to act like he doesn't speak English. But the lawyer starts talking about how David sold his sperm 693 times between 1991 and 1996 under the name Starbuck at the Grabowski-Levy Clinic. Due to a mix-up, the clinic used his sperm for many clients, resulting in David having 533 children. 142 of them want to know who their father is. The lawyer explains that even though David signed a confidentiality agreement, some of his children may challenge the legal documents, demanding to learn his identity. Shocked, David starts speaking in Spanish, insisting he's not David Wozniak and tries to get the lawyer to leave. The next day, David meets with Brett, who explains that his children are suing to learn their father's identity, arguing it's their right to know. This makes the case difficult to handle. Despite the situation, Brett is excited because this unusual case will make a name for him as a lawyer. He gives David an envelope with the identities of the 142 children who want to know who their father is. Although Brett is required by law to hand it over, he advises David not to open it. However, David ignores the advice and opens the envelope when he gets home. The next day, he goes to Brett and asks him to join him in meeting one of the children. He had read about Andrew Johansson, a professional basketball player, and wants to see him in person. They attend Andrew's game, where David cheers for him. When Andrew's team wins, David feels proud, almost like a father. Afterward, David talks about Andrew as if he's an extension of himself. Brett suggests they could plead insanity so David wouldn't be held responsible for his sperm donations, but David doesn't like the idea. That afternoon, David plays basketball with his team, feeling inspired by Andrew. Later, he visits Emma, who works as a police officer. He tells her that he has decided to take responsibility for his life and wants to prove to her that he can be a good father to their child. Later, Alexei brags about how much he loves his child and encourages David to have one, but David responds differently than expected. He then announces that Emma is pregnant. At home, David looks at another profile from the envelope. The next day, he goes to a coffee shop and runs into his other son, Josh, who's upset about a phone call. David orders an espresso, but Josh is rude while making the order. David, reminding him he's a barista, tells Josh to be more polite to customers. Josh gets frustrated, saying he's an actor missing the audition of a lifetime by working at the coffee shop. Feeling awkward, David leaves but stays in his truck outside Emma's house. Later, David returns to the coffee shop and offers to cover for Josh while he goes to his audition. To prove he won't steal, David offers Josh his truck full of supplies. As the shop gets busier, David starts messing up the orders. When the owner arrives, David explains that Josh had to leave for an audition. The owner fires Josh, saying he's not a good actor and is wasting his time. David defends Josh, saying it was his idea, but the owner blames him for Josh being unable to pay his rent. Feeling bad, David meets Josh when he comes back. Josh immediately knows he's been fired, but he excitedly tells David that he got the role and is now officially an actor. David congratulates him, happy for him. Back home, David opens another profile and finds his daughter, Kristen, talking on the phone. He notices a pizza delivery man outside her apartment struggling and gets an idea. David knocks on Kristen's door and gives her the pizza. She's still on the phone arguing about money, so David says the pizza is free because she won a contest. Confused and stressed, Kristen tells him to leave, but David notices she's upset. He explains that the restaurant has a policy not to leave customers in such a state. Kristen suddenly falls silent, and David checks on her to find her struggling to breathe after injecting herself. Panicked, he rushes her to the hospital, but as soon as she wakes up, she tries to escape. Orderlies stop her, and when the doctor asks who David is, Kristen says he's her father, realizing that it's all part of her act. Surprised, David finally admits that he is her father. The doctor explains that Kristen is refusing rehab, but since she's underage, David can make the decision for her. David tries to convince Kristen to get help, but she begs to be released, saying she doesn't want to be locked up and lose her job. Trusting her, David signs the release papers. At her apartment, Kristen thanks him, promising she'll work at Bloomingdale's for the rest of her life. The next morning, David waits anxiously for Kristen outside Bloomingdale's, growing worried as time passes. Finally, he sees Kristen running to work, and David feels relieved. Inspired, David throws out his garden and puts his children's profiles up on his apartment wall. He starts visiting his kids, helping them in small ways, supporting one in their career, stopping another from getting into trouble while drunk, and protecting one of his daughters from catcalling. After meeting several of his children, David tells Brett that he's decided to become a guardian angel for his 533 kids. Brett laughs it off but suggests it could help with his insanity defense in the case. Later, David finds Emma sitting in his truck, telling him she's about to have her first ultrasound. Nervous, she asks David to come with her for support, and he agrees. They head to the clinic, where David feels a sense of joy seeing the baby on the screen. Afterward, they sit at a playground, and Emma starts to feel scared about becoming a mother. David reassures her, telling her she'll be a great mom. Still unsure about him, Emma decides to put him on probation as the father, and David happily agrees. One day, David looks at another profile and decides to visit Ryan, who is living in an assisted care facility due to multiple sclerosis. Although hesitant at first, David spends the whole day with Ryan and helps him get to bed. Another time, David follows his son Channing and finds out he's involved with several men. He tracks Channing to a hotel. When David arrives, he realizes the gathering is for Starbucks children. Surrounded by his kids, David looks around and even spots Christian among them. At the event, Taylor asks David if he has anything to say. Nervously, David mentions that while everyone is focused on finding Starbuck, it's important they've found each other as siblings. The crowd applauds. As he's leaving, Christian asks why he's there, and David lies, claiming to be Ryan's adoptive father. Other sons recognize him, so he repeats the lie. Later, Brett warns David that his actions could hurt his case. He tells him to stop tracking his kids, as it only adds to his mistakes. David feels like he's finally doing the right thing, but as he walks away, Brett tells him to stop seeing his kids, which Vigo overhears. Back home, David is beaten by the people he owes money to. After failing to borrow money from others, he finds Vigo in his apartment, who already knows the truth and points to the wall full of his children's profiles. David asks if Vigo will expose him, but Vigo isn't sure. Vigo asks about David's job, and David says he works at a meat shop. Vigo, a vegetarian, talks about how eating meat harms the world. Despite their differences, Vigo asks to stay with David for a few days to get to know him. 2 weeks later, David complains to Brett about Vigo's long philosophical talks. Brett advises him to do whatever Vigo wants to avoid being exposed. One night, David invites Vigo to play basketball, and after Vigo plays poorly, he invites David to another gathering of the Starbucks kids. David turns him down because of plans with Emma, telling Vigo he has a real family. This offends Vigo, who insists that he and the other children are also part of David's real family. That weekend, David and Vigo hike together. David skips meeting Emma to be with him, but is surprised when they arrive at a campsite with all his children. David fears Vigo will expose him, but Vigo says he wants to keep the truth secret. David bonds with his kids, sharing meat from the shop for a barbecue. The half-siblings enjoy their time, unaware that their father is with them. Later, David brings Ryan to watch the sunrise, then admits to him that he's his father and promises to visit again. The next day, Emma joins David's family for dinner. During the meal, their father shares how he and his wife dreamed of going to Italy, and David surprised her with a trip when she became ill. He tells Emma that despite his flaws, David has his special moments. After dinner, Emma asks how David paid for the trip, and he admits it was from his labor job. The next day, Brett informs David that the camping trip with the Starbucks kids is trending. Brett suggests suing the clinic for damages, but David starts to feel uncertain after seeing the media ridicule Starbucks. While shopping for baby supplies, Emma calls Starbucks horrible and unnatural. Later, David learns the people he owes money to hurt his father. He rushes to see him, but his father refuses. Desperate, David meets Brett and decides to proceed with the countersuit. In court, Brett and David sue the clinic for damages. The clinic's lawyer argues the children have the right to know their father, but Brett counters, highlighting the chaos the clinic caused. Some children testify, explaining their desire to know their father. Brett points out the media humiliation, which wouldn't have happened if the clinic hadn't overused David's sperm. The judge rules Starbucks will remain anonymous and awards $200,000 in damages. Brett is happy with the win but feels for the children. He celebrates with David, jokingly calling him his lover on TV. David watches the reporters interview his children, who are disappointed but still hope Starbucks will reveal himself. At the meat shop, Brett warns David he could lose the countersuit money if he confesses. That night, David tells his father he is Starbucks. His father, recalling his own struggles, offers David his inheritance to pay off his debts, reassuring him that people will still love him. The next day, David confesses on social media, then rushes to the hospital where Emma gives birth to their son. The following day, David's family visits the hospital, and he proudly tells everyone he's their biological father. Later, he proposes to Emma. Emma says yes to David's proposal, but when he reveals he's Starbucks, she's shocked. She thinks he's proposing to make his confession easier and says he's no longer her son's father. David insists no one can take away his fatherhood and admits the experience is new, but he finds joy in having 533 children. David knows it's risky, but he does it for his kids and assures Emma the proposal was sincere. Emma believes him and kisses him. David's children meet their new brother, and he bonds with each of them.
Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell icon, and stay connected with us.